All right, we are back in another exciting day of geometry, looking at congruent triangles, specifically their corresponding parts. So, what does this mean? Cpctc, well, that is our shorthand for saying corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Obviously a mouthful and it's a lot to write out, so we abbreviate Cpctc. So what does that look like? Well, if I've got these two triangles and I'm given that AB is congruent to DE, BC is congruent to EF, and AC is congruent to DF, what I know here is that I've got triangles that are congruent by side, side, side. So what that means is, obviously I've got these tick marks here that pair my corresponding sides to each other, but I'm also going to have corresponding angles that are going to be congruent to each other. So where pink and blue meet, angle A and angle D, those two angles are going to be congruent. Where pink and green meet, angle B and angle E, those will be congruent to each other. And where blue and green meet, those will be congruent to each other as well. So what I have shown here, again, let's just get it down, our out loud thoughts. I had my three givens, and I'm going to put them all in one step. If you prefer to write them out separately, you are welcome to do so, but you can also start consolidating them. So those were my three givens. We know that this showed by side, side, side that I've got congruent triangles, and what's going to be different here is that I have to write the triangle congruence statement. It's not given to me. So whatever order we follow for the first triangle, we have to follow the same order for the second triangle. So if I call the first one ABC, I'm going from pink to green. I need to make sure I'm following the same pattern for the second triangle. Pink to green will be DEF. So again, we already talked about those triangles are congruent by side, side, side. So I've got all my corresponding parts. So A and D are corresponding angles, which means they are congruent. And I can just say my reason is Cpctc. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay. Moving on to our next example, angle HGJ is congruent to angle KJG. I had that on the wrong side. Whoopsie. HGJ is over here. Here is HGJ. Here is KJG. And then angle KGJ is congruent to angle HJG. Okay, I can also see that these triangles are sharing a side. So it's going to be congruent to itself by the reflexive properties. So you should be able to pick up on what I'm saying, that we've got angle, side, angle here. So I'm going to just write down our thoughts as we're going along. Again, I'm going to put my two givens in one step. You are welcome to split them up. So those were my givens. I've got my shared side that GJ is congruent to itself by the reflexive property. So I have congruent triangles because of angle, side, angle. And again, I have to write the triangle congruent statement myself. Whatever pattern I follow for the first triangle, I have to follow for the second triangle. So if I go no tick marks, 1, 2 for the bottom, that would be HGJ. I just have to follow the same pattern for the other one. No tick mark 1, tick mark 2, KJG. So what does that mean? All of my corresponding parts are going to be congruent. So obviously they're sharing that side in the middle. KJ will be congruent to HJ. And GH will be congruent to KJ. And my third pair of angles that don't have tick marks will also be congruent, H and K. So when this proof is asking me to show that HG is congruent to KJ, I know that they are because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Now we do have two more examples on the back we're going to work, but I just want to go ahead and say now that you cannot use Cpctc until you have shown that you have congruent triangles. That has to come first. Okay. Moving along, here my given is that line FH bisects angle GFJ and angle GHJ. Those were my one given. So what does that mean? Well, if GFJ is being bisected, that means that angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And how do I know that? Well, because if an angle is bisected, then it is divided into two congruent angles. If you don't have that wording memorized yet, you can always look in your dominoes. The other part of my given was that angle GHJ was being bisected, so I know that angle 3 and angle 4 are also going to be congruent for the same reason as number 2. Okay, I can also see that once again they are sharing a side. So FH is going to be congruent to FH, and the reason is the reflexive property. So what I now have is angle side angle, which shows triangles are congruent. So again, with my naming, for the top one, I'm going to go no tick marks, 1 tick mark 2. So GFH, and I need my triangle symbol, is going to be congruent to triangle, following the same pattern in the bottom, GFH, JFH. My reason we already said is angle side angle, so what that means is obviously they're sharing this side, so it's congruent to itself. GF is congruent to JF. GH is congruent to HJ. Again, they correspond. And then this third pair of angles is also going to be congruent. So my conclusion that FG is congruent to FJ is true. And my reason is that corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Okay, last one. Angle B is congruent to angle Y. And C is the midpoint of BY. So I'm going to put those in one step. So I know I've got those congruent angles. Now if C is the midpoint of BY, that means that BC is congruent to YC. The reason for that is if a point is the midpoint, then it divides a segment into two congruent segments. Again, if you don't have that wording memorized, you can look in your dominoes. And then looking at my diagram, I've got these vertical angles here. So angle ACB is going to be congruent to angle YCZ because vertical angles are congruent. So what do I now have? Well, I've got congruent triangles because of angle side angle. So I have to write the congruent statement myself. If I name the top triangle BCA, following that same pattern for the second triangle, that would be YCZ. And then I can label all of my corresponding pieces. These obviously have matching tick marks already. I know BA corresponds to ZY. AC corresponds to CZ. And then my third pair of angles are also congruent. So when the proof wants me to show that AB is congruent to YZ, I know that they correspond because they have matching colors. So I've got my corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And that concludes our CPCTC notes.